Fantasy Animation is an online educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. As well as this podcast, Fantasy Animation publishes a weekly blog featuring regular contributions from professional animators and academics and offering up creative insight into the history, theory, and practice of making fantasy stories through cel, stop motion, and digital animation. So, whether you're a budding creative, a fan, a student, or a researcher interested in these overlapping medias, mediums, and genres, be sure to find out more at fantasy-animation.org. But for now, do enjoy the show.
We're broken people now. We're burning out. So cold and bleeding now, now. Gonna let you down.
Hello everybody and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And your orc sidekick, Alex Sargent.
You are indeed my orc sidekick, and you've sneakily given away the episode, or the film that we're doing for this episode. We've got another listener's choice for you, and we're doing Bright, which is a $90 million Netflix original, starring a host of famous faces, including Will Smith, and Noomi Rapace, and it's an odd one. I've just come out of well, I say just come out. I've just watched it. I was going to say just come out of a screening, but we're not doing that anytime soon. I watched it. It's odd. It's strange. I kind of like it. It was a sort of a doomed failure, but and I feel like Alex, you're of the same sort of opinion. You didn't hate it. You're sort of, how are you feeling? Middling to good on this one?
I would say middling to fine. I thought the premise was really great, and I thought there were some fun things to talk about in terms of the way the film uses sort of fairy tale races to talk about allegory and talk about contemporary race relations. I don't necessarily think it's always particularly successful or knows what it's doing with it. And I think there's an issue of tone management in the movie, but I think we could have a very productive conversation about how the film skirts between its identity as a fantasy movie, its identity as a sort of cop drama, its sort of use of urban spaces, the clash between the urban and sort of fantasy creatures, the role of allegory, which is something we've touched on the podcast before, but I'm hoping to sort of really get into in this episode. So for me, lots to talk about, very fantastical, but not necessarily successful all the way through.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a few notes on sort of social, quote unquote, social discourse via fantasy. But most of my notes, I was thinking really about world building, and obviously this was one of our alternative presents, and we'll come to the suggestions that we had a little bit later on. But this was a suggestion based on our alternative presence, and actually, I think this idea of kind of fictionality and worldhood touches a little bit with debates within animation studies and the turn to sort of like space and world building, and so a few of my notes are on that, but also, I guess, broader questions of fictional world building and what this means for the way we understand logic and autonomy and believability and all those, and the rules of a particular kind of fictional world. So, yeah, I mean, it's a good one, I think, to certainly talk about those things, as well as a few little, a peppering of animation along the way. But as I said, this was a recommendation that was given to us by Murray Leader, who regular listeners of the podcast will hopefully remember that he was a very special guest when we did our SCMS special episode, I don't know, about a couple of years ago now. And he gave us a whole range of examples. Cast a Deadly Spell, which takes place in an alternate 1940s with magic. Its sequel, Witch Hunt. And at the end of all these wonderful suggestions, he just put one line, which was, "That disastrous Will Smith thing, Bright, is a good example, I suppose." So we immediately, I think me and Alex took that immediately as a challenge accepted sort of scenario, yes. And off we went. And so Bright is, it's I don't really know sort of where to begin. It's our second Netflix. We've done Disenchantment, which is obviously a Netflix special television show. This is our first, I think, Netflix original series. As I said at the start, $90 million, set in an alternative Los Angeles. And my first note is, why is the fairy in the bird feeder? So there we go, Alex. That's your starter for 10. So what are our initial thoughts with regards to Bright?
Right. Well, I think we need to sort of do the setup if people haven't seen it yet, which is that essentially, and you can tell me, Chris, whether I've done justice to this. The film posits an alternative world that's sort of what if Lord of the Rings is the medieval period, this is contemporary 2020, in the sense that the film is set in a in a human city. Is it set in Los Angeles, or it's
Yes.
set in
Yeah, Los
right?
Angeles. It's an elfified Los Angeles. So it's the Los Angeles skyline. I was reading a bit about its visual effects, which was the convergence between four different companies. And one of the sort of pieces that I read on the film was about the real world Los Angeles skyline that was sort of tweaked and amended with elf and orc architecture, if you will.
I certainly will, and you that's right up your bag, Chris, because you love a digitally altered landscape,
I
or
do.
certainly a digitally urban landscape.
Oh,
That's right within your wheelhouse.
yeah. Yeah.
Why do you love them so much?
So I don't know. So it comes from, I think, one, an interest obviously in animation more broadly, in if that's not become clear over the last 50 odd episodes, animation's ability to sort of world build, and there is, I guess, certainly a prerequisite, or there's been a preoccupation within animation studies about animation as an inherently spatial art, writing that has matured around this idea of animated worlds. So I'm thinking of Suzanne Buchan's, there's an editor collection called Animated Worlds. Eilish Wood has got an article called Reanimating Space. What do animated worlds do? And Buchan says that, these are realms of cinematic experience that are accessible to the spectator only through the techniques available in animation filmmaking. So animated worldhood, I think, is a particularly sort of interesting area. What do animated worlds do, can do, should do? What are the worlds prone to do versus live action forms of fiction? And then coupled to that with I teach a very small module on fictional worlds, and hopefully I'll be able to drip feed some of that writing and some of that really interesting scholarship into the next 50 minutes to an hour or so, just to sort of flesh out, I think, what Bright is doing and why it's clever. I think perhaps more clever than perhaps some critics thought, in the way that it's doing what it's doing with fantasy, and what it means to integrate fantasy in this way. So yeah, a digitally altered landscape is very exciting to me.
Sure. So we enter into a digitally altered Los Angeles, and it's digitally altered because essentially, as we find out through sort of backstory, a Lord of the Rings-esque scenario took place approximately 1,000 years ago. It's classic Lord of the Rings stuff. Races teamed up, a battle against a Dark Lord. Most of the races are on one side, the nominally good side, and then the evil side of the Dark Lord, which was eventually vanquished, with of course, the orcs. And this has created enormous sort of apartheid, or to be honest, I guess like a segregated contemporary American reality, whereby we have most races living in harmony with one another. Elves, fairies are not so much in harmony. They're more sort of treated like pests, but they're sort of certainly flapping about in all their CGI-tastic fashion. And the story centers on the police partnership between Will Smith's character, who is a human, and Joel Edgerton's character, who is an orc, and he is the first orc to serve in the LAPD. So the film essentially plays like a crime drama, in which a racist cop played by Will Smith, and I think the casting of Will Smith in this role is interesting. Actually, sort of Hell's nominally progressive views, but views that are challenged by his sort of inherent dislike of his partner just because he is an orc, and a plot unfolds that involves magic, and crime and gangsters, and violence, and eventually you can imagine a sort of redeeming arc whereby Will Smith learns perhaps that his partner isn't so bad after all, despite being an orc. That's about a fair synopsis, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's in terms of the topics that it touches on. You're right. It's in terms of its orc clan politics. It's about
Yes.
Respect and tolerance, and it's a social class commentary. It's about systemic violence. It's about a contemporary Los Angeles whose history, and this is the thing, I was wondering whether the convergence of contemporary Los Angeles with this sort of history of magic actually impacts its culture, technology, and politics. And perhaps one of the sort of criticisms I've got of the film is that it doesn't perhaps interrogate that enough. We were talking before we went on air that this felt like a 3-hour movie cut down to 2. And so I'd like to know a little bit more about the kind of culture, technology, and politics of this world fleshed out sort of thing. But it's heavy. I think it would be fair to say it's heavy in its metaphors, in the way that it uses and handles magic to create. I think at one point Will Smith talks about a ghetto fairy tale, and it's exactly that. It's that kind of convergence between the real world, this real sort of urban space, with magic. And we talked about this on the podcast before. You know, the Who Framed Roger Rabbit oil and water syndrome, which is a sort of convergence between a kind of gritty modern fantasy setting, or in the case of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, 1940s noir cityscape, and this sort of fantasy intrusion that allows the film to talk about institutional racism. So there is a lot, and masquerading as you say, kind of speciesism through this orc and fairy and elf sort of landscape. So there is a lot going on in the film, I think, and so I'm sort of excited to pick it apart a little bit in a good way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think so. Essentially, how much you like the film is going to be probably dependent on how intriguing you find that central premise. And as someone that's had enough and has read quite a bit of sort of fantasy debates over the Tolkien mode of fantasy, which has this very stable set of species, a very stable iconography, and is sort of rooted in Anglo-Saxon myth and legends, English folklore, European folklore, and is rooted in a sense of sort of romanticized and fantastical history. There's been a lot of writing on the sort of inherent conservatism of that, in that part of the pleasure in something like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, is a pleasure in a return to a certain way of being, where particularly in terms of politics are controlled through the individual, and there's a certain regressive quality to all these films. And what I quite like is that this movie attempts to play with that and to offer us a sort of contemporary vision of a Tolkien mold fantasy set with the same stable set of creatures, but in a world much more like our own. And therefore, it starts to ask relatively provocative questions. So, in the first couple of minutes, say 5-10 of this movie, there was a line where I think Will Smith says, "Fairy lives don't matter." And one can't help, and be reminded, and the film was made a few years ago, but of course it was made during the Black Lives Matter movement had established itself, but not become the cultural force that it is, of the sort of attempt to map some problems that are inherent within the fantasy genre, problems of speciesism, orcs are evil, humans are good, all that kind of stuff, and critique them by sort of mapping them onto the logic of contemporary politics and contemporary race relations, and sort of saying, why is this okay but this isn't okay? Now, whether the film has any success at doing that is probably another thing we could debate about. I think it sets up far more interesting ideas in the first 2 minutes than it ever manages to then interrogate. But I do think the idea of mapping the logic of a sort of high fantasy storytelling onto contemporary urban settings, and therefore using that almost to critique. If you see it as a critique of traditional fantasy storytelling, it becomes far more interesting and far more subversive than if you see it as a satire of contemporary race relations, because it's certainly not very good at doing the latter.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think the film is perhaps not at its best when it's a fantasy story that's sort of been covered with a Trump era coat of paint. I don't think it's perhaps successful in that way. And I think part of the reason for that is that it does, I don't know, and maybe this is actually what makes the film really interesting to talk about, that it's sort of, I jotted down a few things, and it's very, as I said, obvious in its metaphors and its language in many ways when it's talking about institutional racism and the idea of a clan and a clique, and Joel Edgerton's character Jacoby being this first orc police hire. Essentially, he's called at one point a diversity hire. So it paints with a very broad brush, to continue the art metaphor and paint metaphor. It paints with a very broad brush in terms of its what it's doing, its racial markers in terms of its language. You have dialogue like there's one moment where an internal affairs officer, who is essentially coming along to try and dispute Jacoby's series of events where he let an orc, a fellow orc who had shot at Ward, so that's Will Smith's character, he'd let him go, and he's talking, and the internal affairs officer kind of comes along to do his sort of internal affairs business, and they're always evil, or they're always antagonistic, and he says, he's talking about the qualities of an orc, and says it's not racism, it's physics, trying to sort of qualify views on exceptionalism by talking about kind of a fantasy biology. And then the rest of the film is littered with these sorts of moments where slurs, essentially, where I think the film is again heavy in its metaphors. So there's a moment sort of later on where part of Jacoby's I guess rejection by his fellow clan is that he's called a round tooth. So his teeth were removed. He looks more hospitable, I think, as a police officer. But he's got a round tooth. He's got a false orc, and he's called an unblooded coward. So these are all wielded in the film as a way of marking out Jacoby the Orc's sort of exceptionalism, both and in the fact that he is non-human, but also to show that he is different. He's even different from his own clan. So and then it uses that to talk about kind of race and stuff. I guess my question about fantasy, or that again goes back to your point about how the film is interesting depending on how interested you find, or how interested you are in the central premise. And for me, the film perhaps didn't do, it sets up some really nice stuff in the first couple of minutes, but it doesn't do much with sort of, say, intersectionality. It doesn't position the orcs, as anything other than thugs. So it doesn't sort of nuance the representation of the orcs by talking about the intersection of class and race. And if intersectionality is the moment, or the idea where multiple forms of oppression compound themselves, ultimately the orcs are painted again with this in a very broad way. They are kind of thugs, and that makes it easier to identify Jacoby as the sort of messiah figure who ultimately rises again by the end of the film. So I felt that it didn't sort of give the nuance and detail to the orcs and flesh out their clan politics in a way that was perhaps satisfactory.
So here's where I think I'm slightly more up for the movie, and I think found it slightly more successful. I agree with you that the film sort of is a mixed bag, but I think the main issue with it is tone management and a sort of a three-way competition that is going on throughout between sort of three aesthetics: the fantastic, the allegoric, or the metaphoric, and the sort of parodic or satiric. And I think it's really interesting because you're essentially talking about three modes that are very often overlapping and have been written about both for how complementary they are of one another and how oppositional they are to one another. And I think here is a case where actually the three modes don't weld together very well. Maybe it's a case that, two's company, three's a crowd. Because if you see it as an allegory of contemporary race relations, which it tries to be certainly on occasions, then the critique you're throwing at it is completely accurate. If you see, and it would fit with, and what the problem with trying to fit that with a sort of magical structure, and this is a classic, I've talked about the idea of a thinning narrative in the past. This is a classic thinning narrative, actually. Beneath the fact it's a cop drama, it's also a film about the fact that a world has lost magic, magic is refound, and magic is attempted to be brought back into the world. So it's in one level a thinning narrative that tries to sort of celebrate magic, celebrate the fantastical, but it does it both by allegorizing the fantastical, which is hard to do right for lots of different reasons, which we can get into, and to use it as a vehicle for satire. And that's where we get Will Smith. Will Smith's casting is really interesting, both in terms of its race relations, but also in that Will Smith partners an orc as a police drama. Is it's Men in Black 2. It's and there are scenes in this movie which are very much in the more Men in Black satirical, it's funny mode. And you can see Men in Black in many ways as a satire. Men in Black's a great movie, by the way. I don't know if that needs saying on the podcast. We should do an episode on Men in Black sometime.
We should. And about halfway through Bright, I thought, why didn't we do Men in Black? But carry on.
Well, this is it, right? That's probably the main criticism of Bright is that why isn't this Men in Black?
Yeah.
Because Men in Black you can read as a sort of pretty fun satire on immigration and immigration laws in the United States. And there's an opportunity to make a film a bit like that in terms of race relations, because what you're saying about the orc and the way orcs are represented. If you made Will Smith a white character and you made Joel Edgerton a black character and you applied the same schema, you are essentially talking about every single cop drama, or at least about 100 cop dramas that have been made. You're talking about the movie where the black police officer from the wrong side of the city chooses his cop identity over his race identity, and is redeemed as a result because of the narrative. And there is an opportunity to make that movie and pull it and make that narrative strange by pulling it through the realm of the fantastic and using the fantastic as a prism through which you look at these genre tropes and go, isn't that ridiculous? Isn't that stupid? Why are all the orcs grunting? Why are all the orcs reduced to sort of their bestial components? And there you've got something. But unfortunately, the film doesn't quite know whether it's using fantasy as a vehicle for satire or using fantasy as a vehicle for allegory. So what it ends up doing is sort of neither, and then the fantasy is not particularly magical either. So you've got a sort of a disgusting sauce of three different aesthetics trying to compete with one another, and it's not that pleasant to digest.
So from what you're saying, the treatment of the orcs as less than nuanced and complex in their characterization as sort of archetypes or caricatures or stereotypes or whatever you want to call it, is interesting because it taps into the ways in which non-white identities in these kinds of buddy movies have historically been positioned. Is that what you mean?
I think I'm saying it could have been more interesting if they'd
Yeah.
have gone down that road more, but they only really flirt with doing that.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Well, it hits a sort of continuous argument in sort of debates over race and the representation of race in fantasy storytelling, which is one side of the argument says that an orc is an inherently racist caricature, presenting a story in which an entire species is irredeemably evil is a racist trope and therefore encourages racist values. And an anti-racist critique would be to call that out for what it is and stop reading it, frankly, or at the very least adopt a critical approach to the storytelling. Another is to say that an orc is an impossible creature. If an orc is racist, it is racist in the manner that is impossible, and therefore is just as likely to be critiquing racist structures through its impossibility and highlighting the strangeness and the fantastical nature of racism and racist logic as it is to cement and affirm it.
You
In
should
the
write
same
about
way
that.
that
You should write about that. You should write about that in a little book on Lord of the Rings, Alex.
So it's really difficult to sort of, and obviously the answer is it depends on the film, depends on the story, depends on how you read it, and probably somewhere in between the two. But there is basically it comes down to, is fantasy a metaphor for some sort of cloaked reality? Is it a mimetic tool? Is it actually representing the world as it could be or as it is? And the writer is using fantastical creatures to say real life things, or is it sort of subverting real life things, but and satirizing them by making them objects of the fantastic?
So
If that
does
makes
that mean
sense.
that kind of that three pronged sort of
Yeah.
typology? So the fantastic, the allegoric, and the parodic. Is
Yes.
Bright then a film that sharpens our awareness of what each of those categories could look like? Because I don't think the film, obviously the film is not a parody. It's it's a satire, I think, on certain kinds of things and certain kinds of race relations in contemporary America, and deliberately so. And in a minute, I'd like to talk about whiteness, which is
Sure.
equally represented in the film. And so is Bright then for you that makes a little bit of sense in the way that Bright doesn't quite work? Within that, we can find differences between the fantastic, the allegoric, and the parodic, the way in which fantasy is mobilized in these kinds of stories.
I think that's exactly it. Is that if what's Bright is interesting, almost the things that are wrong with Bright are as equally interesting as the stuff that is right with Bright, because right with Bright is a hard thing to say, by the way.
Yes.
But the things that are right with Bright, and the things that are wrong with Bright, are equally interesting, because what they do is they highlight the murky world between these three competing, overlapping aesthetics. And there's been lots, there's in terms of the relationship between fantasy and allegory and the relationship between fantasy and satirical, there are as many works that argue that those two things are oppositional as they do argue that they are complementary in some way. So it's in, I'd almost like to set students some reading from that debate and then make them watch Bright, because that's a really interesting way of playing out the issues that come with trying to make these things come together as one, because they're all actually fundamentally quite different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like I feel a hasty syllabus rewrite coming on. Right, we're going to pause the podcast a little bit and our conversations on Bright to talk to you listeners about our also rans when it comes to alternative presents, our alternative presents, if you will.
What a gag, Chris! What a gag! Yes, we had as always loads of suggestions online for various examples of fantasy animation we could be doing on the podcast, and we thought it'd be a shame not to share a few of them with you in the middle of the episode here. So from Twitter, we have an academic named Kat Lester who works at the University of Birmingham, who specializes in horror cinema and its relationship to childhood. And she has suggested Back to the Future Part 2. I love Back to the Future. I love all three of them.
Yep.
I constantly oscillate about which is my favorite. I know exactly what Kat's talking about in terms of Part 2 and its use of an alternative 1985. Is it animation-y enough for us to ever do on the podcast, Chris? Please think of a reason why it is.
I mean, yes, I think it probably is. I think the use of sort of split screens and the fact that you have kind of two Michael J. Foxes interacting at various moments, I think you could definitely pass that off as animation. And certainly the third one has a lot in terms of the kind of steampunk aesthetic, the use of the Wild West. I mean, you're right. All three are wonderful, and it's like picking your favorite. It's like picking your favorite Toy Story film. Okay, so we also had a recommendation on again on Twitter from James McDowell, who teaches film studies at the University of Warwick, and he suggested CSA, the Confederate States of America. So this is really getting into sort of alternative histories, alternative timelines. So it's essentially a mockumentary from the US, and it's essentially offering an alternate timeline where the Confederacy wins the American Civil War and essentially establishes a new states of America, if you like. So I don't know too much about the film. I also don't know how much animation it's got in it. So it's from 2004, so it's perhaps one to sort of to source out. But it's I think it's very much within the wheelhouse of what would have happened if. So we've kind of been talking in our conversations around Bright about the sort of alternative nature of worldhood and fictionality and things like this. So it's very much within that sort of using alternative history to sort of satirize, I think, the current state of play. So thank you, James.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting premise. I really want to check the movie out, actually. We've done documentaries on the show before. We've never done a mockumentary, which seems like a wasted opportunity. We should definitely think about doing that sometime.
Yeah.
We've had another suggestion, again on Twitter, from Dan, who should be drawing. Dan is a London-based animator. And he said it's not animated. Well, I'll stop you right there, Dan.
Yeah.
But it's not animated. But Children of Men, that's a gem of a film. Yeah, okay. Well, one, Dan, it is animated. If we count VFX as animation, and I and Chris, do we?
We do. I mean, if we count entirely computer-generated birthing scenes with a baby as animated, then yes, this film is animated. But that in itself, the fact that it's not animated, or the suggestion that it's not animated, I think raises bigger questions, about what we think about when we come to animation. But it's not
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's not one of your. Well, is it one of your faves, Alex? I feel like it's a film we taught, but no,
it's not, Chris. It's not one of my faves. No. Hey, I don't hate the movie, but I'm growing to hate it because I just can't stand everyone going on about how good it is. I think it's a thoroughly mediocre film.
Okay.
And I say this loud and proud on the podcast, but I don't say it loud and proud in the halls of University of Portsmouth because, of course, I work with the esteemed Deborah Shaw, who specializes in Alfonso Cuarón. So I don't actually know what her feelings are on this particular movie, but I'm too scared to ask her in person, it would seem. So I'm communicating indirectly via a podcast.
You coward. Okay, so I mean, we had a host of other suggestions. Just to pick out a final one, this is on Reddit from the Scotty345. So this was interesting because it's a suggestion for a video game. So the video game is called The New Order: Last Days of Europe, and I'm going to read out their blurb description because it's sort of really engaged with what we were asking, I think, when it comes to alternative presence. So it takes a really critical eye on what would happen if the Nazis had actually succeeded in conquering Europe, and the result is that the regime was just far too unstable to last. And then talks about Germany, how it was content in a Cold War with the United States and Japan, both of which are dealing with their own massive internal issues because the USA would probably have broken down politically. So there's a really interesting description, summary of what the New Order, the Last Days of Europe is about. And it actually reminded me, checking out the Scotty 345's description, similarities to a recent TV program called SSGB from 2017, which essentially offered a similar alternative history. It was a BBC series, I think, with Sam Riley and Kate Bosworth, and based on a novel by Len Deighton, who also wrote the Ipcress Files. So what would have happened if the Nazis had been triumphant? So that in itself provided some provocative imagery about. Certainly, I think in SSGB there's a shot of Buckingham Palace with sort of Nazi insignia up the side. So it's a really this idea of alternative presence, I think, really yields quite provocative imagery and a kind of hypothetical conditional of what if. But where does this leave us in terms of we've done Bright, or we're halfway through Bright? Alex, where does this leave us in terms of next week's or next episode's listener's choice?
Well, Chris, we've been thinking, haven't we, about what our next listener theme would be, which we'd like your suggestions on, and we've come up with what we'd like to know your best fantasy animation buddies, and we're interested in this because obviously we're talking about the unlikely pairing today of Will Smith and an orc. So we want to know what other sort of friendships in the world of fantasy animation you think are worth talking about, worth celebrating, worth thinking about. Maybe they're really unlikely pairings like this one. I'm thinking off the top of my head something like, I know, Shrek and Donkey, or are we thinking of some sort of really sort of, wonderful friendships? Maybe the friendship between the dwarfs in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, although you can't have that one because you've already done it.
Yeah. So give us your favorite fantasy animation friendships, your unlikely pairings, your interspecies alliances, if you will. And I think there's a kind of host to choose from. So hopefully this will get listeners thinking about, I think, buddy movies more broadly. Obviously, something I think previously we talked on the podcast in terms of sort of late 80s, 90s Hollywood, biracial buddy pairings. How does that perhaps translate to animation? So think Linguini and Remy. Think your Ratatouille. Think your kind of Shrek and Donkeys, your Woody and Buzzes, and then get in touch.
Yeah, let us know via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, all of those through the handle FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. And you can also do the old-fashioned approach and email us at fananimresearch@gmail.com. And we will share as many on the show next week, as well as selecting one for us to cover on the episode in a month's time, remember. So we do this once a month.
Wonderful. So, Alex, we should, you are my buddy, and let's get back to the show. I wanted to talk a little bit about whiteness because one of the ways that I think Bright achieves or seeks to achieve some of its potency, if you like, is through its positioning of elves. And early on in the film, so the idea, I think, as with all buddy movies ever, they are a reluctant pairing. There, I've said it. But by goodness, by the end, they're going to get on. So Jacoby and Ward, so Joel Edgerton's character and then Will Smith's character, Darryl Ward, are unlikely pairings. They sort of an interspecies alliance that get together, but ultimately there is a lot of resistance to Jacoby being the first orc policeman, and ultimately that fuels a little bit of resentment between the two characters that in another film would be played entirely for comedy, but here it's treated with a degree of kind of tense, certainly threat of violence between them, and which ultimately escalates as the film proceeds. And then at one point early on in the film, they both then go to Elf Town, which is essentially a space for it's kind of white, very white, middle class, if not higher, a space of high fashion and exotic cars. And actually, the style of the film changes. You get kind of shots of glamorous women getting out of sports cars, and I was just trying to get my head around the idea of whiteness in the film, because I think we all struggle with the ways, well, not struggle, but we encounter challenges in the way that we teach race in the classroom, and whiteness being this. Richard Dyer has written on whiteness as being difficult to talk about because it's really about nothing, or it seems like at first glance to be about nothing in particular. Things are always other things before they are about whiteness. They are about
Mm.
kind of national identity, or they are about class before they are about whiteness. Whereas blackness or non-white identities tends to trump everything else. So things are always about non-white identities and always about blackness before they are about, The Color Purple is Richard Dyer's good example. The Color Purple will always be a film about blackness before it's a film about family and society and all these kind of class and all these kinds of things. And so I wondered actually what you made within your reading of the film and your
Mm.
kind of knowledge of fantasy in relation to race and orcs and all this kind of thing, and elves obviously, which are, again, I think in Lord of the Rings are very white, both in design,
Hmm.
clothing, and hair. So I just wonder what the sort of, we've got Elf Town, we've got rich elves who are very white. The antagonist of the
Yeah.
film is what. So I just wondered what we can do, or
Mm.
if you had any thoughts on that are clearer than mine.
Well, I don't know if they're clearer, but hey, throw more mud at it, and some of it will stick, right? But I'm glad you mentioned that sequence, because that's exactly an example of sort of the opposite of what I was saying about its treatment of orcs. In that sequence gets it right, the tone right, because that in by making elves a representative figure of whiteness and making the mirror between whiteness as essentially a middle class, well, upper middle class, um, world of privilege, and by attributing that to a different race, the film manages to make strange a trope that wouldn't be so strange if it were a bunch of white people walking around a 1980s cop movie.
Mm,
If they drove through Beverly Hills and it was like that, we could have an interesting conversation about whiteness, but I don't think the viewer, the sort of nominal inscribed viewer, would be encouraged to see the world of Elftown as such an odd place as we might find Rodeo Drive
mm,
if we were walking around it now. So I think that is a moment where the tone is managed right, and it does do something kind of fun and interesting in terms of race, and it's almost the antithesis of what we're talking about in terms of black identity. And I don't know what that says in terms of power relations, because maybe it's a case where whiteness can take more subversion, and yet feel still like it's not. It can be mocked without being without its power structure being subverted just through the inherent. I'm reminded of writing on masculinity, where it's said that sort of masculinity can take the bearer of the gaze and can be turned into an object of spectacle momentarily, because it can bear that before taking back control over the power relations in the way that femininity can't. So you can turn Daniel Craig into a specimen of erotic desire, but he'll quickly take control of the narrative and the storytelling again in a way you can't do with Ursula Andress in Doctor No. So I wonder if there's a certain similar relationship going on here. Whiteness can take it, but blackness can't. And I don't mean that therefore blackness is more fragile, but I'm saying that sort of maybe the fact that one sequence works better than the other is actually more about our contemporary society than it is about anything going on in the filmmaking itself.
mm. Well, a couple of things. One, thanks for the
Yeah,
Bond reference. We got that
yeah.
in.
We had to get it in.
Yeah, got that in.
Um,
Yeah. Secondly, I wonder whether that sequence also works because of at that moment. Because I was trying to think about alignment, allegiance, and subjectivity. So I don't think our allegiance is with. And I always, again, if we're thinking about fantastic, allegoric, and parodic as things that get
mm,
muddled, the idea of subjectivity, alignment, and allegiance being this myth where if you see the world through the eyes of a particular character, you align with that character. No, you don't. You just see the world through their eyes. So I think allegiance wise, the film is interesting because in no way is your allegiance with the police, because of a lot of them are corrupt, and there's some interesting. I don't really know what to make of Rodriguez, the Mexican cop, who
mm,
says things that like Mexicans are still getting blamed for the Alamo, as a way of momentarily deflecting, America has only just got to grips with Mexicans as opposed to orcs. What's
yeah.
that saying about the two figures in the film, Rodriguez and Jacoby? But I don't think your allegiance is with the cops, and I don't know. subjectivity. I mean, alignment. You're aligned through the narrative, I think, with obviously Will Smith
Mm.
and Joel Edgerton, because that's how buddy movies work. Your alignment is with those characters, even if your allegiance with them is slightly off. And then subjectivity. So I was thinking the way that trip to Elftown works, and Will Smith says, "Oh, I hate Elftown," and I think the film in that moment shares his point of view. And I was thinking, I wonder whether that's a moment where our position as spectators is made clear. We're critiquing whiteness, and or certainly it was a moment that made me think, oh, so I'm seeing this world through the eyes of a non-white character. I'm looking at the absurdity and the superficiality of prosperous neoliberal whiteness or capitalist whiteness. You see, as I said, you see shopping bags and you see high fashion and sports cars, and I just thought, I wonder, yeah, the film is
Good
never
point.
as interesting as it is after the first sort of 25 minutes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, again, I don't really know what to sort of make of that. But you're right, that sequence kind of stuck out where I thought, cool, this is a really pointed critique at its target.
Well, I guess the casting of Will Smith is really important to talk about in that respect. And I hadn't thought about it. Of course, we're seeing Elftown. It's not just that they're elves; it's also that we're seeing it through the eyes of an African American man. Um, and that's a really important part of the way this film successfully or unsuccessfully tries to negotiate race relations, because we're talking about LA, and LA with historic violence and racial tensions in African American courts, but of course also with Mexican identity. It's equally problematic in that respect. So it's an interesting setting. And then you've got Will Smith as a sort of surrogate figure, both in terms of the spaces we inhabit and where we go on the journey and who we go on the journey with, but also he is the figure that goes through the the really banal transformative journey from racist cop to not racist cop at the end of the movie. The Green Book, the driving Miss Daisy approach to this sort of stuff. Yeah. So it's very, very, very interesting um, that it's Will Smith. Why don't we start with that?
Yeah, no, well, there's a bit at the beginning of the film where, in fact, just before he sort of massacres that fairy and the purple bluish
Sure.
blood flies everywhere, and you think, this is set up nicely, the theme of tolerance amongst the police force. But his neighbors are, and I think this is where the kind of the ghetto of ghetto fairy tales comes from. He's sitting, or his neighbors are uh, I guess a community or a small black community sitting on the front lawn, and he says something in passing like, keep playing the music really loudly because I want to sell, it's not like I'm trying to sell this house, so thanks for that. And so
Yeah.
he's kind of, it's set up as a sort of, he's antagonistic anyway, like he's an antagonistic, grumpy, and why wouldn't he be, because he's been shot and injured however many years ago or whatever, and here we are, and he's the Tommy Lee Jones in the Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith Men in Black relationship. He's now the grumpy one, sort of thing. And so when you see that moment between him and his neighbors, it kind of comes across as a class war, because he's trying to sort of navigate his own identity, and his house is not spectacular, but then his antagonism towards class extends the other way when he then visits Elftown. Will Smith is an interesting character, an actor anyway, and we've talked previously on the podcast about his role in the remake of Aladdin, of course. And there's a bit of academic writing around coolness, black identity and coolness, that actually uses Will Smith and the film Hitch, so a 2005, I think, romantic comedy, where he embodies the magical Negro archetype. So the idea that there is an inherent mysticism, or a fundamental mysticism to black identity, that allows it to access naturally elements of cool, hipness within identity politics that can then be transferred onto, in the case of Hitch, Kevin James's character, a white male, and then you get bigger questions around kind of minstrelsy and whiteness performing as blackness, and all these sort of interesting debates. But yeah, I mean, Will Smith the film is obviously a star vehicle for him. He's not the alien. He's not hidden behind makeup. It's all prosthetic makeup. I think certainly in the construction of Jacoby as a character, whereas there are other visual effects in the film around the magic wand and the articulation of this sort of elfified Los Angeles that are digital, but he's not hidden, so it's very much a kind of a star vehicle for him. But I was struggling to place his blackness within the film more broadly.
Well, I think the only other thing to add to that sort of summary of his star persona is that he plays roles, or his most fondly remembered roles are roles in which he either narratively or through the reception of the show has made white masses comfortable in black spaces,
Mm.
to be sort of crudely schismatic like that. But if you think even back to things like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air or Men in Black. Men in Black, he's an LAPD cop who then gets brought into this white world of these Men in Black who are, it's an undercurrent in the movie, but they're all white other than him.
Yeah.
And so what you've got there is a character, a black man who is comfortable inhabiting white spaces.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about his role in Wild Wild
Yeah.
West, where he's sort of uh, if we know the Western's history with race relations, and so yeah, I kind of hadn't thought about his role as a star, kind of smoothing out anxieties around his black identity in that way.
He does it sort of largely by trying to square the circle of cultural definitions of blackness versus cultural definitions of whiteness, right? So it's interesting you mentioned that that beginning sequence with the music. Well, yes, it is to do with class, but actually it's to do with race also. If you sort of think of sort of what definitions of African American male identity are often defined as in terms of loudness, brashness, all this kind of stuff versus white muteness, white, reservedness. Quiet neighborhoods are good neighborhoods. Loud neighborhoods are problematic neighborhoods. So he is asserting a certain class dynamic that is racialized.
Absolutely. No, I hadn't thought of that, and I think this is going to be one of those things where I think I've said it and might not have said it, but I'll say it anyway. It reminds me the way that you described kind of sort of whiteness is reserved, and blackness as loud, brash, animated. It reminds me of Sean Nagai's work on in a book called Ugly Feelings, which is about black hyperactivity. And she talks a lot about Eddie Murphy, but also talks about black stand-up comedians, black stand-up comedy, and the performance or blackness and its relation to animatedness and kind of hyperactivity and an excessive agency and energy that sort of can't quite be contained. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. So that what does that then do to his character in Bright? Because he's not like that. Is he then in this buddy movie structure because of his sort of relationship to other black identities in the film? Is he embodying the white character and the orc partner is embodying the other? Or because I'm trying to get my head around.
Well, that's how I would see it. Yeah, is that Will Smith's cast? If this is Lethal Weapon, Will Smith is. Well, no, that doesn't work either because of the sort of the age dynamics there. But in whatever generic cop movie this is, Will Smith is the white grizzled
Tommy Lee Jones, yeah,
played probably by Josh Brolin right now.
Yeah.
Joel Edgerton's character is the black rookie, and orcs are coded. I would say I'd need to rewatch the movie to make sure because I think there's a danger that we're equating it with black simply because of recent events and things like that, making it the most prominent racial sort of category to talk about. But I guess there's you could code him as Mexican. But I don't necessarily. I would have to think through how the orcs are particularly presented, because they're certainly not presented in a way that fits the descriptions of sort of cultural definitions of blackness we've described thus far. They're not. I mean, they're brutish, so there's that issue, but they're not lively, hyperactive, or that kind of stuff. The character. In fact, the character of Jacob is quite beige. Just back to the fact the film's not that terrific to watch. He's quite a dull character, and one of the reasons he's quite dull is that he has this identity where he's like, I'm a cop, That's all I am. That's all I ever want to be. I'm a cop first and an orc second, all this kind of stuff, which sort of denies him any identity other than I'm good at, following a procedure. So he's not that compelling a character actually. But I've lost the point I'm making really, which is
No, it's no, I'll take the baton and drop it, but I'll give it a go. No, the I hadn't kind of thought about Will Smith's position in this as embodying the kind of the grisly white man. I mean, I'm thinking it's interesting that the director of the film, David Ayer, wrote Training
mm,
Day, which obviously has Denzel Washington and Ethan Hawke. So I must admit I haven't seen the film, and I'm probably one of the only people on the planet not to have seen the film. And it's a film for which Denzel Washington won an
sure.
Oscar. I think the film was directed by Antoine Fuqua, if I remember. But Ayer wrote it, and again that kind of plays. I think that plays with and subverts the buddy movie structure. There are obviously issues. You mentioned age as well, but I think there are. It's a buddy movie, and buddy movies of themselves, as we've talked about previously, have got this kind of history of the biracial turn that is often in animated films mapped onto speciesism. And here it's kind of made quite explicit. But to have a white character, a white actor, Joel Edgerton, Australian, I believe, perform as another. He's performing as as an orc, and then you have Will Smith playing white.
Yeah.
Again, these are quite kind of broad terms. Then you get into the okay, so a white man, Joel Edgerton, is performing as another. And he's the marginalized, and so yeah, it's again. There's lots to say. I'd like to get this film in a seminar room,
Because if you've just flipped that casting round, and you made Joel Edgerton Will Smith's character, and you had Will Smith playing the orc, the film would be, for better and for worse, far less safe in what it's trying to do.
Yeah,
Um, you know,
yeah.
and that in itself is worth unpacking as to why. There's something about Will Smith playing that role that makes it feel safe, and that whatever it's saying, it can't be saying it that savagely because it's the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air saying it. It's the guy from Men in Black. It's the guy from Wild Wild West. It's the guy from Independence Day. All this baggage helps the movie feel more cozy than it I think perhaps needs to be to make the points it's trying to make in a particularly critical and particularly biting manner. Which is why I sort of would prefer if it were more Men in Black 2 this time with fairies. In fact, wasn't there a movie that was essentially that? What was it called? With Jeff Bridges and
I can tell you it was called R.I.P.D. with Ryan Reynolds.
that's it, R.I.P.D.
Yeah.
Yeah, now people have tried to make this movie twice. I'd like someone to make it well because it's fun, but the idea is fun, but the execution is poor.
Yeah, no, the integration of sort of alien life within a buddy movie structure. Yeah, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. Interesting enough, you mentioned Josh Brolin, who obviously he played the younger
Yeah.
Tommy Lee Jones in the third Men in
Yeah.
Black. So there we go, we're full circle, as it
There
were.
we are.
I mean, Bright. As I said, I'd like to get it in a classroom and sort of think through some of these things. Outside of its sort of social discourse via fantasy, what it's doing with this alternative LA.
Well, in order for you to be able to get it into a classroom, Chris, we're going to need you to explain some of its sort of animated VFX identity, because then you can put it on your syllabus. So, is there anything interesting to say about its use of VFX? From my Luddite perspective, it seemed that I thought it was I thought we were going to have a big conversation about motion capture when I sort of read the premise, and actually, it turns out there is no. Joel Edgerton's mainly. It might be a shot or two, but he's mainly in heavy prosthetic makeup, which is perhaps an interesting choice as why that isn't animated. But we could talk about that. But other than that, the main sort of VFX shots seem to be the fairies. They're captured that way, and the sort of magical effects sequences. There's a whole plot we haven't really gone into about sort of so bright in this world is a magical dweller, someone that person that can use magic, and magic is sort of banned and forbidden, and it's seen almost like a nuclear bomb or something like that. And brights are people that can use magic, and we see a story where a young elf sort of comes of age surrounding this sort of plot. So, is there anything that struck you about the VFX that's worth sort of unpacking?
I think I was expecting more. I was surprised by the decision, same as you, to go with prosthetics, because to pass an image through the intermedial grading suite is quicker, more expensive, but ultimately removes the performer having to sit in this act of fortitude under hot and heavy makeup and practical aesthetic. And actually, I quite liked the fact that the film went back to that. It reminded me of like Farscape,
Sure.
the television program from the 90s, where you've got humans dressed up in kind of costumes. So I quite enjoyed that. I like the fact that the magic was reserved for the, I guess now I'm gonna make a faux pas by saying the explicit fantasy elements, because all of the film is fantasy, or it plays with fantasy within the construction of its fictional world, which we'll hopefully get to. But I liked the fact that there was an absence of magic, actually, apart from these little moments. There was an absence of effects where I thought there might be. So uh, it sort of fleshes out the world. You see a few skylines, but actually it's quite grubby in the way that it presents this modern urban fantasy setting. It's quite grubby, and the film doesn't dwell too much on its effects. You have interactions between the cop and his contemporaries. You have lots of kind of office scenes. You have the arrival of internal affairs, and it's only when Will Smith and Joel Edgerton essentially encounter their first bright. And Numi Rapaz's character is called Layla, and she's kind of hunting this wand. And it's really just about the three characters, so the Bright, and then the two policemen who are all on the run from Layla, who wants this wand. And so I quite like the fact that the magic. The VFX, the explicit kind of digital effects, which were four companies, so Allura, Mammal Studios, Olin VFX, and Pixel Playground, to give them their dues. A kind of a combination. And we've talked previously on the podcast about how companies work and what kinds of work they get and how work is assigned, and they kind of contract it out. So I thought that was kind of quite interesting that there are four main studios working on the picture. But I liked the fact that it made the magic grimy, and through downplaying some of its visual effects, I thought that it sort of it took the focus away from the fantasy a little bit and tried to make us forget. And I wonder whether that's where Jacoby's line about being a policeman first. That's what the film's trying to do. It's fantasy at the base, but it's trying to be a police thing on top of that. So the film is like the character that it's a fantasy film, but the cop story is the most important, because on that level is where the tensions play out and the action set pieces kind of play out. And then fantasy sort of intrudes and comes out of this wand that for large parts of the film is hidden in a bag and is there, and we know it's there, but it's not really, the film doesn't do that much with it. But knowing is enough.
I think this film doesn't quite know what to do with magic. In the same way the characters,
or how to handle it. I've got exactly that note. Will Smith doesn't know what to do with the wand,
and
at the
that's
end.
a sort of nice little metaphor for what the film's, because and this is at the heart of this problem between allegory, satire, and fantasy, is that there's been writing on a lot of these modes, because quite often fantasies are funny and quite often fantasies are allegoric, and there's a temptation to see both. Fantasies can often be unintentionally read allegorically. Very famously, Tolkien wrote a prologue to The Lord of the Rings after it had been out for about a decade, where he sort of basically wrote a little essay at the beginning of the book saying, people have tried to read this as an allegory for lots of things, including the Second World War or the atomic bomb. And I'd just like to say, stop it. I don't like allegory. I never intended this to be an allegory, and this isn't an allegory. I think the famous line that's often quoted is, I cordially dislike allegory and always have done, or something to that effect. I'm probably missing up a bit of the quote there. And there's a lot of sort of historical opposition between allegory and fantasy, and it comes down to the crux of it, is that at the heart of it, both satire and allegory are deconstructive impulses. So I think Walter Benjamin puts it when he talks about allegory, that allegory is to writing like a ruin is to a building. It shows us the structure, but it also shows us the absence of a structure. So allegory deconstructs the literal meaning. Satire deconstructs the literal meaning. It's a deconstructive device. And supposedly, fantasy is a constructive device. And the whole point of fantasy is to try and generate the reader's belief. I don't like that word, but to generate the reader's, I guess, enthusiasm for the magical event. So fantasy as an impulse pushes you towards the magical event, and satire and allegory pushes you away from it so that you can consider other secondary modes of reading it. So I think it doesn't know whether it wants to push you towards or away from the magic. Sometimes, and the very nature of the plot requires you to invest in the wonder, splendor, possibilities of magic, and yet it doesn't know how to depict it visually in any interesting way. And it can't resist having scenes where, like, Will Smith makes gags about the fact that his partner's just been brought back to life in a sort of slightly, you know, reminiscent way of other movies. So I don't think it knows what to do with magic.
No, I had a kind of one. I had a Will Smith doesn't know what he's doing in this film moment, but I thought that's not what I mean. What I mean is that he at the very kind of climax of the film, he's essentially, and this isn't really a spoiler, but he's holding the wand, and he says, "Okay, I'm holding the wand, and now what?" And I thought that's exactly the film's way of, I don't know, it was a sort of, how do you handle magic? And perhaps again that goes back to the kind of problem about, or the tension between how to integrate fantasy into a particular, because I hadn't really, and I felt this when we put out the call for alternative presence. I thought it's quite a hard one in many ways, and trying to think about alternative presence in relation to other kinds of fictionality. And the construction of a fictional world, which I'm now going to go on a minute rant on. But fictional worlds, I'm interested in fictional worlds, and this idea of an alternative presence. So a film, in this case, that is set in a world that is our world, but has a kind of pretty standard deviation. In this case, the intrusion of magic, and as you said at the start, Alex, that the film set, or the world is set up that history has been wrought with magic, and it's there and it's being rediscovered. But there is something that happened 1,000 years ago that sets the terms of the way that we understand the world. So there's a lot of writing on fictional worlds. And Ruth Ronin, I think, has usefully given us a definition of fictional worlds in relation to possible worlds, and talks about. So this is writing in a book on possible worlds and literary theory, and talks about that possible worlds, possible worlds create a world, or based on a logic of ramification, determining the range of possibilities that emerge from an actual state of affairs. Fictional worlds are based on a logic of parallelism that guarantees their autonomy in relation to the actual world. So I think Bond movies, the Mission Impossible movies, are fictional worlds because they are they run parallel to our world. They share our technology, our culture, our history, and the thing that makes them fictional is the character of James Bond and Ethan Hunt. But in both of those worlds, Hitler existed, the Second World War happened, apartheid happened, and so forth and so on. So these are fictional worlds, and the thing that makes them fictional is the character. She then argues that possible worlds are rooted more in a logic of this sort of ramification. So the conditional tense, what would happen if something had happened? And that is the central premise. And I think this is what this film is. It's a possible world because it is rooted in this logic of ramification. The second very, very quick point I think builds on that is by a writer called Kendall Walton, who talks about the relationship again between fictional worlds and possible worlds. And he says that fictional worlds are always incomplete. And the reason for this is that a film doesn't need to set out, a Bond movie doesn't need to set out every single rule and part of its logic for us, because we can assume things. If you see a police car, you can make assumptions about its justice system. And as Victor Perkins, who also writes on World, says, all that we know about fictional worlds is all that we can possibly know. So we just see what we need to see, and we can make assumptions about the rest. But possible worlds, rather than fictional worlds, are always complete because their premise is rooted in a kind of, what if this had happened? Possible worlds need to kind of explain everything for us. They need to explain the rules, because it's so far out there and so rooted in this logic of ramification that we kind of need to know the details and the logic of it and what rules it's living by. So things need to be itemized in a way that in fictional worlds can just happen. I don't need to know about Bond's history, but I probably need to know what happened in this bright fictional world because it's rooted in magic. And I think part of the reason the film perhaps doesn't succeed is that it doesn't give us enough of what we need to know to understand its central premise as a possible world.
Yeah, well, the interesting, the logic of ramification struck me in that particularly because that's the problem with magic, is that magic by its very nature is a sort of it destroys causality. That's its pleasure. It ruptures causality of any kind. Yeah, it doesn't matter if the causality is fictional or not. A magical event is an event within any context which ruptures a sense of logic and causality. So, what do you do with that in a narrative framework? Because as soon as you've got a creature or a force or a power that can do anything, that can do magic, what there are no stakes anymore, right? So, and this film try, I think, relatively cleverly, but doesn't succeed in the end. It tries to ground magic in a sense of possibility, in a sense of repercussion, by sort of framing it as this, oh my god, it's a weapon, it's a it's a thing that disrupts the world that we want to stay in. So how on earth, but at the same time, it then does, when it starts having a positive effect on these people's lives, it's hard to contain it within the narrative structure. So there's always a perennial problem. And actually, if you look at a lot of very popular fantasy texts, they're not often that magical, in the sense that there's not often a lot of spells going on. Most spells are quite limited. Magical artifacts, magical beings, magical moments, magical contained magical powers, fine, but usually they're rooted in some sort of limitation and causality. There's very rare that you get a magical event in which you're sort of supposed to celebrate the complete rupture of all causality and logic, because there's nothing much to do with that once you've set that up.
Mm.
And this film sort of does set that up as a weapon. And then when the weapon comes into being, you're like, okay, right, so now there are creatures that can do anything, say anything, wave their wand and bring people back from the dead. So why am I worrying about any jeopardy anymore?
Well, doesn't Will Smith's character at the end say, so basically you had this power the whole time, can't you just magic us to
Yeah.
Palm Springs then? I want to get out of here. And that's the crux of the matter. That the film again doesn't know what to do with its magic. So it posits it as a resolution, but ultimately, because there is going to ultimately be a sequel, I'd be interested to know, one, whether what it does with its magic, but two, whether it starts to kind of flesh out. I read a lot of stuff on the film that said it might be better as a miniseries, might have been better as a miniseries, a kind of cumulative exploration of a particular kind of fictional world where magic once was, but isn't anymore. And these are the repercussions, and then it's rediscovered, and then what happens next?
Or if it were more like Men in Black, you'd do a sight gag at the end, and she would magic them to, Bora Bora,
Yeah.
and you'd cut to Tommy Lee Jones at the bar drinking a daiquiri.
Yeah.
So and that would be fine too, because then what you're not doing is you're not asking us to actually take the magic seriously. You're you're using magic as a device for satire and comedic subversion, which is okay too. But so it's back to that perennial problem of what do you do with those three impulses.
Yeah. So we're approaching time. I feel we're approaching.
I think so. Yeah.
I don't have any final. I mean, I'm looking at my notes. I think the idea of kind of I put how to handle magic, but also how useful is magic in the world of the film, and I'm not entirely sure that the film has a kind of answer to that. I do think its metaphors and its sort of allegory work well to an extent. I do like some of the things. I'd like a bit more, like a bit more magic to identify its possibility, and also, I don't know, a bit of engagement with the alternative nature of it being Los Angeles, I think. And there's not perhaps as much interrogation of what an alternative Los Angeles might look like. And some of our other suggestions for alternative presence had things to do with kind of time travel. So ways in which the world is retrospectively altered, and these sorts of forking path puzzle narratives where you sort of loop back and see the world with an event changed. But I like the fact this was an alternative presence from the off and asked us to quite quickly get up to speed with some of its sort of autonomous logic, the way in which its world is set out, and the world has ruins, and so it has a past, and if it has a past, how do things become ruins? Well, probably a war or a battle. What do people war about? Religion, cultural differences, national. So I like the fact it started to play with certain kinds of markers in its fictional world building. But I mean, let's give it. It deserves a rewatch, and then we'll stick it in a classroom and see what happens.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I don't think it's bad. I think it's an interesting movie. And it's a we in the profession like to use the phrase, it's a good teaching film, and usually you can tell a good teaching film that the things that are wrong with it are equally interesting as the things that are right with it. So I'd watch the sequel. I don't think it's the worst film I've ever seen. I'm still waiting for someone to do this film justice properly.
Sure.
Maybe but this isn't quite it. But hey, we got a decent enough podcast out of it.
We did. Go on then. I was going to offer to do the roundup, but I can't do the roundup.
Well,
So
if you want to have a go,
no,
listeners,
no, I really don't. If I do, it will be recorded at a later date and sent to you as a audio file, so you can seamlessly edit it in. But you
right.
have the gift, so go for it.
Okay, right. Well, I guess the first bit of admin is to remind everyone that on our next listener choice episodes, this is in a month's time, we are looking for your suggestions for your favorite fantasy animation buddies. Okay, so we've staked our claim quite heavily for Men in Black there, but let's have some alternatives. What's your favorite buddy in fantasy animation? A mismatched pair, an unlikely duo. So let us know favorite pairing, and we'll take your suggestions, read as many as we can out on the podcast in a month's time, and we'll pick one and discuss it on the show, potentially with a guest, depending on how we do. But until then, I'll tell you what, one more thing. We have not had many reviews on Apple Podcasts for a while. They've dried up a little bit. We're still getting the star ratings in thick and fast. We really appreciate those. But I tell you what really helps is if you can just write a couple of sentences and give us a star rating, preferably 5 stars, but that's your choice. Tell us about them. Briefly why you like the show. It'd be really, really handy. It'll take you about 30 seconds if you're quick, and it helps us shoot up the visibility. So a quick plug for that. Please, whatever you're doing right now, if you buy a computer, could you just stop for 30 seconds and write a review? We would appreciate it.
I'll also do a little shout out on that note. Do have a little navigate through the website. And as you're listening to podcasts, reading blog posts, if there are things with Bright that you really love, or you'll go back through our archive of podcasts and a wide range of blog posts written by a diverse kind of group of scholars, practitioners, animators, do let us know. We'd love to kind of have think pieces or editorials or things that are kind of responding to some of the debates around something like Bright, where we kind of perhaps don't quite know what to do in terms of making sense of it. So yeah, get in touch. And equally, if you've seen something over the past few months that you think fits the fantasy animation bill, have a look at our How to Contribute tab. You can drop us a line and send us your ideas. We'd love to sort of shore you up for our blog post schedule in 2021.
You can contact us through the various means. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Reddit, and the handle is FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. And you can also use our Gmail address, fananimresearch@gmail.com. Send us an email. Tell us whether you like the show or not, whether we missed something out. We will hear your corrections and omissions and blush accordingly, and take part in the conversations online. But until next episode, that has been us. We will now journey back into the real present rather than this possible present that we presented in this episode. That's a lot of P's in one sentence for my mouth, so time to stop talking. Chris, it's been wonderful. I will see you next time. Take care.
Bye.
So this is where we are. It's not where we had wanted to be. If half the world's gone mad, the other half just